Standing in my grandmother's vintage Chanel dress, watching my own daughter roll her eyes at me across the crowded ballroom, I never imagined that the worst humiliation of my life would lead to the most empowering decision I'd ever make. The champagne flute in my hand trembled as Madison's voice carried across the elegant venue, dripping with the kind of disdain that only a 25-year-old who'd never worked a day in her life could muster. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months earlier, I'd been living what most people would consider a charmed life. My name is Victoria Sterling, and at 58, I was the widow of tech mogul Richard Sterling, living in our sprawling estate in Marin County, California. Richard had passed away 2 years prior, leaving me with more money than I could spend in several lifetimes, and a daughter who seemed to grow more entitled with each passing month. Madison had always been spoiled, but after her father's death, she'd become something else entirely. Perhaps it was grief manifesting in the worst possible way, or perhaps it was simply her true nature finally revealing itself without Richard's firm hand to guide her. Either way, the young woman who'd once been Daddy's little princess had transformed into someone I barely recognized. The first sign of trouble came when Madison announced she was planning her 25th birthday party. Not just any party, mind you, but what she called the social event of the season. She'd rented the ballroom at the St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco, hired a celebrity event planner, and invited 300 of her closest friends. The budget she presented to me was more than most people made in a year. I should have said no. Richard would have said no. But grief had made me soft, and guilt had made me generous. I'd been so focused on my own mourning that I'd perhaps neglected Madison during her time of loss. This party felt like a way to reconnect with her, to show her that despite everything, she was still the center of my world. The weeks leading up to the party were a whirlwind of florists, caterers, and dress fittings. Madison threw herself into the planning with an enthusiasm I hadn't seen from her in years. For the first time since Richard's death, she seemed genuinely happy, and that happiness was infectious. I found myself looking forward to the celebration, imagining how proud Richard would have been to see our daughter surrounded by friends, celebrating life and new beginnings. Madison had insisted I wear something, quote, age-appropriate but elegant, to the party. When I'd shown her the vintage Chanel dress that had belonged to my grandmother, her response was lukewarm at best. "I suppose it's fine, Mother. Just promise me you won't try to be the center of attention." "This is my night." The comment stung, but I brushed it off. Madison was stressed about the party, and stress made people say things they didn't mean. Besides, the idea that I would try to upstage my own daughter at her birthday celebration was so absurd, it barely warranted a response. The morning of the party, Madison called me 3 times before 10 a.m. First, to remind me that cocktails started at 7 and dinner would be served at 8:30. Second, to tell me she'd arranged for professional photographers and that I should try to look natural and happy in the photos. Third, to inform me that she'd invited some of her father's former business associates, and I should please be gracious but brief when speaking with them. Each conversation left me feeling more like a potential embarrassment to be managed, rather than her mother and the person funding this elaborate celebration. But I told myself it was just pre-party nerves. Madison wanted everything to be perfect, and as the hostess, she felt responsible for managing every detail, including her mother's behavior. I arrived at the St. Francis Hotel that evening feeling elegant and confident. The vintage Chanel fit perfectly, and my hairdresser had worked magic with an updo that felt both sophisticated and youthful. The ballroom looked spectacular, decorated in Madison's favorite colors of blush pink and gold, with enough flowers to stock a high-end florist for a week. Madison looked stunning in a custom-designed gown that had cost more than my first car. She was radiant, surrounded by friends and admirers, holding court like the society princess she'd always imagined herself to be. For the first hour of the party, everything went perfectly. I mingled politely, complimented the decorations, and stayed in the background as Madison had requested. The trouble started during the cocktail hour when I was approached by James Morrison, one of Richard's former business partners. James had always been kind to me, and we'd maintained a friendly relationship after Richard's death. He was genuinely interested in how I was coping with widowhood and had some thoughtful questions about a charity foundation I'd been considering establishing in Richard's memory. Our conversation was interrupted by Madison, who appeared at my elbow with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mother, you're monopolizing poor James. I'm sure he didn't come here to discuss boring charity work." Her tone was light and teasing, but there was an edge underneath that made my cheeks burn with embarrassment. James, being a gentleman, assured Madison that he was genuinely interested in the foundation and thought it was a wonderful way to honor her father's legacy. Madison's response was a dismissive laugh. "Oh, Mother has all sorts of grand plans these days. It's sweet, really, how she's trying to find purpose now that Daddy's gone." The conversation ended shortly after that, with James making polite excuses and moving on to speak with other guests. I stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened. Had my own daughter just dismissed my grief and my attempts to honor her father's memory as pathetic attempts to find purpose? The evening continued, and I tried to shake off the uncomfortable interaction. But I noticed that every time I engaged in conversation with other guests, Madison seemed to materialize nearby, ready with a subtle interruption or a comment that somehow made me feel small and foolish. When I complimented the orchestra to Mrs. Henderson, one of our longtime family friends, Madison inserted herself into the conversation to mention that she'd chosen the music herself because she, quote, "knows what sounds sophisticated, unlike some people who are still stuck in the past." When I discussed travel plans with another guest, Madison appeared to mention that I gets a bit confused about logistics these days and might need help planning anything too complicated. Each comment was delivered with a smile and a laugh, as if it were all in good fun. But the cumulative effect was devastating. By the time dinner was served, I felt like I was walking on eggshells, afraid to speak to anyone for fear of providing Madison with another opportunity to publicly diminish me. The final blow came during the birthday toast. Madison had requested that I say a few words about how proud I was of her and her accomplishments. I'd prepared a heartfelt speech about watching her grow into a beautiful young woman, and how much her father would have loved to see her celebrating this milestone. I stood up at the appropriate moment, champagne glass in hand, and began speaking about Madison's childhood, sharing a funny story about her determination to have a pet elephant for her 7th birthday. The story had always been one of our favorites, a charming example of Madison's big dreams and creative thinking. But as I spoke, I noticed Madison's expression growing increasingly uncomfortable. When I finished the anecdote and moved on to talk about her father's pride in her academic achievements, Madison suddenly stood up and gently took the microphone from my hand. "Thank you, Mother, for that embarrassing childhood story that absolutely no one needed to hear," she said with a bright smile that fooled no one who was paying attention. The ballroom erupted in polite,
"Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story."
Laughter, but I could see the discomfort on many faces. I think we can all agree that sometimes mothers just don't know when to stop, right? The room fell into an awkward silence broken only by nervous chuckles from Madison's younger friends. I stood there, still holding my champagne glass, feeling every pair of eyes in the room on me. The humiliation was so complete, so public, that for a moment I couldn't breathe. Madison continued with her own toast, thanking everyone for coming and making jokes about how wonderful it was to be surrounded by people who really understood her. She never mentioned me again, never acknowledged the fact that I had funded every aspect of this celebration, never even thanked me for the heartfelt words I'd tried to share. I sat back down in a daze, mechanically applauding when appropriate but feeling completely disconnected from the celebration happening around me. The woman sitting next to me, someone I didn't recognize from Madison's usual crowd, leaned over and whispered, "She shouldn't have spoken to you that way. That was cruel." The validation from a stranger somehow made it worse. If someone who didn't even know our family could see how inappropriate Madison's behavior was, then I wasn't being oversensitive or misunderstanding the situation. My own daughter had deliberately humiliated me in front of 300 people at a party I had paid for. After the toast, I excused myself to the ladies' room, needing a moment to collect myself before facing the rest of the evening. In the mirror, I saw a woman who looked every one of her 58 years, wearing a dress that suddenly felt too young for her, at a party where she clearly wasn't wanted. When I returned to the ballroom, Madison was holding court with a group of her friends near the bar. As I approached, I caught the tail end of their conversation. "I swear, sometimes I think she's losing it," Madison was saying with an exaggerated eye roll. "Like, who tells embarrassing childhood stories at an elegant dinner party?" I was mortified. One of her friends, a young woman I'd met several times before, noticed me approaching and tried to change the subject, but Madison was too caught up in her performance to notice. And don't even get me started on her fashion choices. That dress is older than I am. I tried to hint that she should wear something more age-appropriate, but does she listen? Of course not. I stood there for a moment, listening to my daughter mock me to her friends, and something inside me finally snapped. Not into anger exactly, but into a cold, clear understanding of exactly what was happening and what I needed to do about it. I walked up to the group and placed my hand gently on Madison's shoulder. She turned around with a startled expression, her face flushing red as she realized I'd overheard her comments. "Madison, darling," I said in my most pleasant voice, "I wanted to let you know that I'll be leaving early." "Thank you for a lovely evening." I leaned in and kissed her cheek, ignoring her stammered attempts at an explanation. "We'll talk soon." I left the St. Francis Hotel that night with my head held high, but my heart was broken. The drive back to Marin County gave me plenty of time to think about what had just happened and what it meant for my relationship with my daughter. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had made a decision that would change both of our lives forever. The next morning, I called my attorney, Margaret Chen, and requested an emergency meeting. Margaret had been handling the Sterling family's legal affairs for over a decade, and she knew both Madison and me well enough to be surprised by my request to completely restructure my will. "Victoria, are you sure you want to make such drastic changes so quickly after an emotional event?" Margaret asked as we sat in her downtown San Francisco office. "Perhaps you should give yourself some time to process what happened before making any permanent decisions." I appreciated her caution, but my mind was made up. "Margaret, what happened last night wasn't an isolated incident. It was just the culmination of 2 years of increasingly disrespectful behavior. Madison has made it clear that she sees me as an embarrassment and a burden. I think it's time I started behaving accordingly." The changes I wanted to make were comprehensive. Instead of leaving everything to Madison, as my current will stipulated, I wanted to establish a series of charitable foundations focused on causes Richard and I had cared about. Education for underprivileged children, medical research, and support for widows and widowers navigating grief. Madison would receive a modest trust fund that would provide her with a comfortable but not extravagant lifestyle, but the bulk of the Sterling fortune would be used to help people who actually needed it. Margaret spent 3 hours walking me through the implications of these changes, making sure I understood exactly what I was doing and why. By the end of our meeting, she was convinced that this wasn't a rash decision made in anger, but a thoughtful choice based on careful consideration of my values and my relationship with my daughter. "There is one thing I want to add," I told Margaret as we were finalizing the documents. "Madison should be informed of these changes, but not immediately. I want to see if she makes any effort to apologize or repair our relationship on her own. If she does, we can discuss modifying the new arrangements. If she doesn't, then she's made her choice and will have to live with the consequences." Over the next 2 weeks, I waited for some acknowledgement from Madison about what had happened at her party. A phone call, a text message, even an email would have been enough to start a conversation about how we could move forward. But my phone remained silent. Instead, I heard through mutual friends that Madison was telling people I'd had some kind of breakdown at her party and left early because I was, quote, jealous of her youth and success. The narrative she was creating painted me as a pathetic older woman who couldn't handle not being the center of attention. The irony was staggering. She was accusing me of seeking attention while simultaneously making herself the victim of my supposed mental instability. It was a masterful manipulation, designed to garner sympathy for her while further damaging my reputation. 3 weeks after the party, Margaret called to inform me that all the legal documents had been finalized and filed. My new will was official, and the charitable foundations had been established with initial funding. Madison was now set to inherit approximately 5% of what she would have received under the previous arrangement. "Are you at peace with this decision, Victoria?" Margaret asked during our final meeting. I considered the question carefully. Was I at peace? Not entirely. I was still grieving the loss of the relationship I'd thought I had with my daughter. I was still hurt by her cruelty and disappointed by her character, but I was no longer angry, and I was no longer willing to enable behavior that Richard never would have tolerated. I'm at peace with knowing that Richard's money will be used to help people who need it rather than funding a lifestyle of entitlement and cruelty, I replied. Whether Madison learns anything from this experience is up to her. A month after her party, Madison finally called me. She was planning a weekend trip to Napa Valley with some friends and wanted to use the family's vacation home. Her tone was casual and friendly, as if nothing had happened between us. She made no mention of her birthday party, no acknowledgement of her behavior, no apology for the public humiliation she'd subjected me to. "Of course, darling," I told her. "You know you're always welcome to use the house." There would be plenty of time for her to discover the changes I'd made to my will. For now, I was content to let her continue believing that her inheritance was secure, while she treated me as an afterthought in her life. 2 months later, I received a call from Madison's friend Ashley, the same young woman who had tried to change the subject when Madison was mocking me at the party. Ashley was clearly uncomfortable making the call, but she felt I should know that Madison had been telling people I was losing my mind and might need to be looked after soon. "Mrs. Sterling, I don't think it's right what she's saying about you," Ashley said quietly. "You seemed perfectly fine at the party. Upset, maybe, but who wouldn't be after being treated that way? I just thought you should know what story she's telling." I thanked Ashley for her honesty and assured her that I was quite mentally sound. After we hung up, I realized that Madison was laying the groundwork for a potential legal challenge to my mental capacity. She was probably hoping to establish a pattern of, quote, concerning behavior that could be used to contest my will if necessary. It was a shrewd strategy, but it was also the final confirmation I needed that I'd made the right decision. My daughter wasn't just spoiled or temporarily cruel. She was calculating and manipulative in ways that would have broken her father's heart. 6 months after the party, I hosted a small dinner party at my home for some close friends. It was an elegant evening, nothing like Madison's extravagant celebration, but filled with genuine warmth and conversation. During dessert, one of my guests mentioned that they'd heard Madison was engaged to a young man from a prominent San Francisco family. The news didn't surprise me. Madison had always been strategic about her relationships, and an engagement to someone with both money and social standing would fit perfectly with her plans for her future. What did surprise me was that I'd learned about it secondhand rather than from Madison herself. A week later, Madison called to officially announce her engagement and to discuss wedding plans. The conversation was polite but distant, as if we were acquaintances rather than mother and daughter. She mentioned that she was thinking of having the wedding at our Marin County estate and wondered if that would be convenient for me. "Of course," I told her. "It's your family home, and I know your father would have loved to see you married there." Madison's voice softened slightly at the mention of Richard. "I miss him, you know. I wish he could walk me down the aisle." For a moment, I heard an echo of the daughter I'd raised, the little girl who'd worshipped her father and dreamed of a fairy tale wedding. But the moment passed quickly as Madison moved on to discuss her vision for the ceremony, which involved essentially transforming the entire property into a luxury wedding venue. "I'll need to hire a wedding planner, of course," she continued. "Someone who really understands high-end events, and will probably need to do some renovations to make sure everything looks perfect for the photos." The assumption that I would fund this elaborate wedding just as I'd funded her birthday party was implicit in every word she spoke. She had learned nothing from our previous experience, still treating me as an unlimited source of financial support, rather than a person deserving of basic respect and consideration. "Well, we can certainly discuss the details," I said carefully. "Why don't you put together some preliminary plans, and we'll go over everything together?" After we hung up, I sat in Richard's old study, surrounded by the books and mementos of our life together, and thought about the conversation we'd had when Madison was 16 and caught lying about her whereabouts. Richard had been firm but fair, explaining that trust was earned through consistent behavior and that actions had consequences. "We love Madison unconditionally," he'd said that night after Madison had been sent to her room. "But love doesn't mean accepting unacceptable behavior. If we don't teach her that her choices matter, the world certainly will, and it won't be nearly as kind about it as we are." I'd thought about those words many times over the past few months, wondering what Richard would think of the woman our daughter had become and the decisions I was making in response to her behavior. I believed he would understand that sometimes love meant allowing people to experience the natural consequences of their choices, even when it was painful to watch. 8 months after Madison's birthday party, my phone rang at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. It was Madison, and she was crying so hard I could barely understand what she was saying. Between sobs, I managed to piece together that she'd been to see Margaret Chen about some wedding-related legal documents and had discovered the changes to my will. "How could you do this to me?" she wailed into the phone. "How could you cut me out of my inheritance? I'm your only daughter. Daddy would never have wanted this." I let her cry and rage for several minutes before responding. When she finally paused to catch her breath, I spoke calmly and clearly. "Madison, you haven't been cut out of anything. You'll still receive a very generous trust fund that will ensure you never have to worry about money. You just won't be inheriting the kind of wealth that allows you to treat people cruelly without consequences." "This is about the birthday party, isn't it?" she accused. "You're punishing me because I hurt your feelings one time. That's not fair, Mother. I was stressed and nervous and I made a mistake. This is completely out of proportion." The dismissal of months of increasingly disrespectful behavior as one mistake told me everything I needed to know about whether Madison had learned anything from our experiences. She still saw herself as the victim of my unreasonable expectations rather than the architect of our damaged relationship. "Madison," I said gently, "this isn't about punishment. This is about values and character. Your father and I worked very hard to build wealth that could make a positive difference in the world. I've decided to honor that legacy by using our resources to help people who truly need them." "But I need them too," Madison protested. "I have plans. I have a lifestyle to maintain. My friends expect certain things from me." And there it was, the heart of the matter. Madison didn't see the sterling fortune as a responsibility or an opportunity to do good in the world. She saw it as her right, something she was owed simply by virtue of being born into our family. The idea that wealth came with obligations to others, that privilege carried responsibility, was completely foreign to her. "Your friends who expect you to maintain a certain lifestyle are not real friends," I told her. "Real friends care about who you are as a person, not how much money you can spend on entertaining them." Madison hung up on me after that, but she called back the next morning with a different strategy. She was calm now, logical and persuasive. She apologized for her behavior at the birthday party and acknowledged that she'd been, quote, "going through a difficult time" since her father's death. She promised to do better, to be more considerate and respectful. It was a good performance, delivered with just the right amount of remorse and sincerity, but it felt rehearsed, like something she'd practiced to achieve a specific outcome rather than a genuine expression of regret or understanding. "I appreciate your apology," I told her, "and I hope you mean it. But changing my will back isn't something I'm prepared to do based on words alone. If you're serious about repairing our relationship, it will need to be demonstrated through consistent actions over time." "How much time?" Madison asked, and I could hear the frustration creeping back into her voice despite her efforts to stay calm. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "That depends on you." Madison made an effort for about 3 weeks. She called me regularly, visited twice, and was polite and attentive during our interactions. But there was something performative about all of it, like she was playing the role of a dutiful daughter, rather than actually being one. She asked appropriate questions about my health and my activities, but I could sense her impatience when I answered in any detail. The facade cracked during her 3rd visit when she brought her fiancé David to meet me properly. David was charming and well-educated, from a family with old money and impeccable social credentials. He was also, I realized within the first hour of conversation, completely unaware of Madison's true financial situation. Over dinner, David made several references to plans that clearly assumed Madison would be inheriting substantial wealth. A house in the Pacific Heights neighborhood of San Francisco, annual trips to Europe, a vineyard in Sonoma County that they were considering purchasing as an investment. Madison smiled and nodded along with these discussions, never mentioning that her inheritance had been substantially reduced. After David excused himself to take a phone call, I confronted Madison about her deception. "He doesn't know about the changes to your inheritance, does he?" Madison's cheeks flushed pink, but she lifted her chin defiantly. "What happens between David and me is none of your business. It is my business when you're allowing him to make plans based on money that you won't have," I replied. "That's not fair to him, and it's not honest." "I'm working on changing your mind," Madison said. "Once you see how much I've changed, you'll put everything back the way it was. David doesn't need to know about temporary complications." The fact that she saw our entire conflict as a temporary complication, rather than a fundamental issue of character and values, told me that her recent good behavior was exactly what I'd suspected it was. A performance designed to manipulate me into restoring her inheritance. When David returned from his phone call, I excused myself early and left Madison to continue her charade. But I made a mental note to have Margaret document our conversation. If Madison was going to continue deceiving her fiancé about her financial prospects, she needed to understand that there would be consequences for that deception as well. A month later, I received an invitation to Madison and David's engagement party. It was being held at the country club where Richard and I had been members for 20 years, and the invitation listed Madison as the host. When I called the club to RSVP, I discovered that the event was being charged to my account. Madison had planned and was hosting an engagement party on my dime without asking my permission or even informing me in advance. The presumption was breathtaking, but it was also clarifying. Despite all her promises to change and be more respectful, she was still treating me as a source of unlimited funding, rather than a person deserving of basic courtesy. I called Madison immediately. "I see you're hosting your engagement party at the club," I said when she answered, "Oh, that." Madison's tone was breezy and dismissive. "I knew you wouldn't mind. You're always telling me to use the membership more often." "I'm always telling you to use the membership for things like tennis lessons or lunch with friends," I clarified. "Not for hosting elaborate parties that I'm expected to pay for without being consulted." Madison sighed dramatically. "Mother, please don't make this into a big deal. It's just a small gathering to celebrate David and me. I thought you'd be happy that I wanted to include you." The manipulation was so blatant it was almost insulting. She'd planned an event, charged it to my account, and was now trying to frame her presumption as a generous gesture toward me. "Madison, I want you to call the club and transfer the charges to your own account. If you can't afford to host this party, then you need to scale it back to something within your budget." "My budget?" Madison's voice rose sharply. "Mother, you know I don't have that kind of money. I'm planning this party because I thought you'd want to celebrate with us, but if you're going to be stingy about it, maybe we should just cancel the whole thing." The threat was clear: pay for the party, or be blamed for ruining her engagement celebration. It was emotional blackmail, pure and simple, and it confirmed everything I'd suspected about her supposed change of heart. "That's your choice," I said calmly, "but the charges will not remain on my account." Madison hung up on me again, but this time she didn't call back to apologize. Instead, I received a call from David 3 days later. He was clearly uncomfortable and apologetic, explaining that there had been some confusion about the party arrangements and asking if we could work something out. "David, I like you very much," I told him honestly, "and I want Madison to be happy. But there are some things about your fiancé's financial situation that you and I should probably discuss." The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult I'd ever had. David was a good man who genuinely loved Madison, but he'd been building his future plans on a foundation of lies. Learning that Madison's inheritance had been substantially reduced was shocking enough, but discovering that she'd been deceiving him about it for months was devastating. "I don't understand," David said quietly. "Why would she lie to me about something like this? I never asked her to be wealthy. I fell in love with her, not her bank account." "I think Madison has confused having money with being worthy of love," I explained. "She's afraid that without the promise of wealth, People won't find her valuable enough to keep around. David was quiet for a long time after that. When he finally spoke, his voice was sad but resolved. I need to talk to Madison about this. About all of it. The conversation between David and Madison did not go well. I wasn't privy to the details, but the result was clear. David called off the engagement 3 days later. Madison, predictably, blamed me entirely for the collapse of her relationship. The phone call I received from her after David ended things was unlike anything I'd experienced before. Madison was beyond angry. She was volcanic in her rage, spitting accusations and threats with a venom that took my breath away. "You destroyed my life," she screamed into the phone. "You sabotaged my relationship because you're a bitter old woman who can't stand to see me happy. You're jealous because Daddy loved me more than he ever loved you, and now you're punishing me for it." The accusation about Richard was designed to wound me as deeply as possible, and it succeeded. Richard had adored Madison, but he'd also loved me deeply and demonstrated that love every day of our marriage. Madison was rewriting history to justify her anger and make me the villain in her story. "Madison, I told David the truth because he deserved to know what he was getting into," I said when she finally paused for breath. "If your relationship couldn't survive honesty, then it wasn't strong enough to survive marriage." "Don't you dare lecture me about relationships," Madison snarled. "You've been alone for 2 years because even your own daughter can't stand to be around you. At least I had someone who loved me until you ruined it." The call ended with Madison declaring that she never wanted to see or speak to me again. She meant it as the ultimate punishment, cutting me off from her life as revenge for my supposed betrayal. But as I sat in the silence of my empty house afterward, I realized that I felt relief more than grief. For the first time in months, I didn't have to wonder when the next manipulative phone call would come, or what fresh demand would be made on my resources and emotional energy. I didn't have to walk on eggshells around my own daughter or pretend that her increasingly cruel behavior was acceptable because she was grieving. The relationship I'd been trying so desperately to preserve hadn't been a real relationship at all. It had been a transaction, with Madison's affection conditional on my continued financial support and willingness to absorb her disrespect without complaint. Now that the transaction had been terminated, we could both stop pretending otherwise. A year after Madison's birthday party, I was living a life I barely recognized. The charitable foundations I'd established were thriving, providing scholarships to deserving students and funding research that was already producing promising results. I'd started traveling again, something Richard and I had always loved but that I'd stopped doing after his death. I'd also developed friendships with other women who were navigating widowhood and learning to rebuild their identities after decades of marriage. These relationships were based on mutual respect and genuine affection, rather than financial dependency or family obligation. For the first time in years, I felt like I was valued for who I was as a person, rather than what I could provide for others. Madison and I had not spoken since her engagement ended. I heard occasional updates through mutual acquaintances, usually reports that she was doing well and keeping busy. I assumed she'd found other sources of financial support, whether through a new relationship or by finally getting a job, though I had no concrete information about either possibility. The holidays that first year were difficult. Christmas morning was the hardest, sitting alone in the house where Madison had opened presents every year since birth. But I'd learned that being alone was not the same as being lonely, and that family was not automatically defined by blood relationships. I spent Christmas afternoon volunteering at a local shelter, serving dinner to people who had nowhere else to go. Among the volunteers was Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman whose own children lived across the country and rarely visited. We struck up a conversation about loss and resilience, about the difference between the family you're born into and the family you choose. "People think tragedy is what happens to you," Mrs. Chen told me as we ladled soup into bowls. "But I think tragedy is what you let it turn you into. You can become bitter and closed off, or you can become stronger and more compassionate. The choice is always yours." That conversation stayed with me as I entered the second year of my new life. I'd made my choice about what kind of person I wanted to be in the aftermath of loss and betrayal. Madison would have to make her own choice about what kind of person she wanted to become. 18 months after the birthday party, I received an unexpected phone call from Ashley, Madison's former friend who had warned me about the rumors Madison was spreading. Ashley was nervous and apologetic, but she felt I should know that Madison was in serious financial trouble. "She's been living on credit cards since David left," Ashley explained. "And she's been borrowing money from friends, always promising to pay them back once her inheritance issues are resolved. I think she's been telling people that you're suffering from dementia and that she's fighting to regain control of the family finances." The information was troubling but not entirely surprising. Madison had always been more concerned with maintaining appearances than with actual financial responsibility. Without access to unlimited funds, it made sense that she would accumulate debt rather than adjust her lifestyle to match her actual income. "Has she asked you for money?" I inquired. Ashley hesitated before answering. "She did, actually. Last month. She said she needed $5,000 to cover some unexpected expenses, and that she'd pay me back with interest once she got access to her trust fund. I told her I couldn't help her, and she got really angry. She accused me of being disloyal and said that real friends support each other in difficult times." The manipulation was classic Madison, framing her request as a test of friendship rather than acknowledging it as the burden it actually was. I thanked Ashley for the information and assured her that she'd made the right decision in refusing to lend Madison money. After we hung up, I called Margaret to discuss the situation. If Madison was using my supposed mental decline as justification for borrowing money from friends, she might eventually escalate to legal action challenging my competency. Margaret assured me that we had extensive documentation of my mental acuity, but she recommended that I undergo a formal psychiatric evaluation to create an official record. The evaluation was humiliating but necessary. Spending 3 hours with a psychiatrist discussing my relationship with Madison and defending my decisions felt like a violation of my privacy, but it provided the legal protection I needed. The doctor's report confirmed what I already knew. I was mentally competent and fully capable of making my own financial decisions. 2 years after Madison's birthday party, I received a certified letter from a law firm I didn't recognize. Madison was suing me for financial elder abuse, claiming that I was suffering from dementia and had been manipulated into changing my will by unscrupulous advisors. She was seeking to have my recent decisions declared invalid and to regain control of the Sterling family finances. The lawsuit was frivolous and ultimately unsuccessful, but it was expensive and emotionally draining to defend against. For 6 months, I was subjected to depositions, medical examinations, and invasive questions about every aspect of my life and relationships. Madison's attorneys painted me as a confused, elderly woman who'd been taken advantage of by people seeking to benefit from my wealth, while her legal team portrayed her as a concerned daughter trying to protect her vulnerable mother from exploitation. The irony was breathtaking. Madison, who had spent months emotionally manipulating and financially exploiting me, was now claiming that I was the victim of manipulation by others. She had somehow convinced herself, or at least her lawyers, that my decision to reduce her inheritance was evidence of mental incapacity rather than a rational response to her behavior. During my deposition, Madison's attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Blackwood, spent hours trying to establish a pattern of erratic behavior and poor judgment on my part. She questioned every decision I'd made since Richard's death, from selling our vacation home in Aspen to donating Richard's extensive art collection to local museums. "Mrs. Sterling, isn't it true that you gave away a Picasso painting worth over $2 million without consulting any family members?" Blackwood asked, her tone suggesting that this was obvious evidence of diminished capacity. "I donated several pieces from Richard's collection to the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, yes," I replied calmly. "Richard always said that art should be shared with the public, not hoarded in private homes where only a few people could enjoy it." "But you didn't discuss this decision with your daughter, did you? These were pieces that had been in your family for decades." "I discussed it with the people whose opinions mattered to me," I answered. Madison had never shown any interest in Richard's art collection. In fact, she once referred to his paintings as dusty old things taking up wall space. Blackwood moved on to question my decision to establish the charitable foundations, suggesting that I'd been unduly influenced by Margaret Chen and other advisors who stood to benefit from managing large endowments. The implication was that I was a naive widow who'd been taken advantage of by sophisticated financial manipulators. Mrs. Sterling, did you conduct independent research into these charitable organizations before donating millions of dollars to them? I spent 6 months researching educational and medical charities before making any commitments, I replied. I visited facilities, interviewed staff members, and reviewed financial records. I also consulted with experts in philanthropy to ensure that my donations would be used effectively. But you made these decisions alone, without input from family members who might have helped you evaluate these organizations? I made these decisions based on my own values and my late husband's wishes. Family members who were interested in providing input were welcome to do so. The subtext was clear. She was suggesting that a loving daughter would have been consulted about such major financial decisions, and my failure to include Madison was evidence of either poor judgment or family dysfunction. What Blackwood didn't understand, or chose to ignore, was that Madison had never been interested in philanthropy or Richard's charitable giving during his lifetime. Her sudden concern about my donations had everything to do with the money she wouldn't be inheriting and nothing to do with genuine worry about my decision-making capacity. The most painful part of the legal proceedings was listening to Madison's testimony. Under oath, she painted a picture of our relationship that bore no resemblance to reality. According to her version of events, I had become increasingly isolated and paranoid after Richard's death, pushing away friends and family members who tried to help me. My mother stopped returning phone calls from people who had been close to our family for years, Madison testified, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. She became suspicious of everyone, convinced that people were only interested in her money. She even accused me of trying to take advantage of her, which was heartbreaking because I was only trying to help her cope with her grief. The manipulation was masterful. Madison had taken the natural caution that wealthy widows often develop about people's motives, and reframed it as paranoid delusion. She'd taken my legitimate concerns about her disrespectful behavior and presented them as evidence of my mental decline. Did your mother's behavior change around the time she altered her will? Blackwood asked. Yes, dramatically, Madison replied. She became secretive about her finances and started making comments about how no one really cared about her, only her money. She seemed to forget all the ways I'd supported her after Daddy's death, all the time I'd spent helping her with practical matters and trying to keep her connected to the family's social circle. This was perhaps the most audacious lie of all. Madison had never helped me with practical matters after Richard's death. If anything, she'd created additional burdens by expecting me to fund her increasingly expensive lifestyle. As for keeping me connected to our social circle, she'd done exactly the opposite, systematically undermining my relationships with mutual friends and acquaintances. When it was my turn to testify, I had to resist the urge to respond emotionally to Madison's lies. Instead, I focused on providing clear, factual accounts of our interactions, supported by documentation wherever possible. Margaret had been thorough in creating a paper trail of my decision-making process, including emails, meeting notes, and financial records that demonstrated my careful consideration of each choice. Mrs. Sterling, your daughter has testified that you became increasingly isolated after your husband's death. How would you respond to that characterization? My attorney, Robert Kim, asked during direct examination. I would say that I became more selective about how I spent my time and energy, I replied. Grief taught me to prioritize relationships that were based on mutual respect and genuine affection, rather than social obligation or financial dependency. Can you give us an example of what you mean by that? Certainly. After Richard's death, I continued to maintain close friendships with people who had known and loved both of us. I also developed new relationships with other widows who understood what I was going through. But I did distance myself from people who seemed primarily interested in my financial support for their various projects and social events. Kim walked me through the specific incidents that had led to my decision to modify Madison's inheritance, starting with her birthday party and continuing through her deception of David about her financial prospects. I testified calmly and factually, without editorializing or expressing anger about Madison's behavior. Mrs. Sterling, do you love your daughter? Kim asked toward the end of my testimony. The question caught me off guard, and I had to take a moment to compose myself before answering. Yes, I love Madison very much. I love the little girl she used to be, and I love the woman she could still become if she chooses to change. But love doesn't mean enabling destructive behavior or accepting disrespect without consequences. Do you believe that reducing her inheritance was an act of love? I believe that allowing someone to inherit vast wealth without first developing character and values is one of the cruelest things a parent can do, I replied. Richard and I always planned to teach Madison about responsibility and philanthropy before she inherited our fortune. Her behavior after his death convinced me that she wasn't ready for that responsibility. The trial lasted 3 weeks, with expert witnesses testifying about my mental capacity, financial advisors explaining my decision-making process, and character witnesses describing my behavior and demeanor since Richard's death. Margaret testified about my thorough preparation for each legal change, providing detailed accounts of our conversations and my clear articulation of my reasoning. Perhaps the most damaging testimony for Madison's case came from David, her former fiancé. Although he clearly still cared about Madison and was reluctant to hurt her publicly, he felt obligated to tell the truth about their relationship and her deception about her inheritance. Did Madison ever indicate to you that her inheritance had been reduced? Blackwood asked during cross-examination, clearly hoping to suggest that Madison's deception was evidence of her mother's mental instability rather than her own dishonesty. No, she never mentioned any changes to her inheritance, David replied quietly. In fact, she actively encouraged me to make financial plans based on the assumption that she would inherit substantial wealth. When I learned the truth from Mrs. Sterling, I felt that our entire relationship had been built on a false foundation. Mr. Harrison, isn't it possible that Madison was simply confused about her inheritance because her mother was giving her conflicting information due to mental confusion? David considered the question carefully before answering. I don't believe that's what happened. Mrs. Sterling was very clear and coherent when she spoke with me. Madison's reaction when I confronted her about the discrepancy was not confusion, it was anger at being caught in a deception. The judge's decision was swift and decisive. Madison's lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice, meaning she could not refile the same claims. The court found no evidence of mental incapacity on my part, and determined that my decisions about my inheritance were rational and well considered. Madison was ordered to pay my legal fees, a substantial sum that I knew she couldn't afford. The victory felt hollow. I had been vindicated legally, but the process had further damaged my relationship with Madison beyond any hope of repair. During the trial, she had lied under oath about our relationship and painted me as a mentally unstable woman who couldn't be trusted to manage her own affairs. Even if I could forgive the financial manipulation and emotional abuse, perjury was a line that couldn't be uncrossed. After the trial ended, I received a brief email from Madison's attorney informing me that Madison would be filing for bankruptcy and that any attempt to collect the legal fees would be futile. Madison had apparently spent what little money she had on the failed lawsuit and was now facing financial ruin. For a moment, I felt a flicker of sympathy for my daughter. Despite everything she'd done, the thought of her struggling financially while I lived comfortably was painful. But then I remembered her testimony, her lies about my mental state, her willingness to destroy my reputation to get access to money she hadn't earned. Sympathy was a luxury I could no longer afford. 3 months after the trial, I received an unexpected visitor. Ashley, Madison's former friend who had warned me about the rumors Madison was spreading, appeared at my door looking nervous and apologetic. She had information she thought I needed to hear, though she was clearly reluctant to share it. Mrs. Sterling, I probably shouldn't be telling you this, Ashley began as we sat in my living room with tea, but I think you should know what Madison has been saying about you since the trial. I braced myself for more lies and manipulation, but Ashley's news was somehow worse than I'd expected. Madison had been telling people that she suspected I had somehow caused Richard's death, and that the changes to my will were motivated by guilt rather than anger about her behavior. She's been suggesting that maybe your husband didn't die of natural causes, Ashley said quietly, her discomfort evident. She says it's suspicious that he died so suddenly, and that you changed your will so quickly afterward. She's even talked about asking for an investigation into his death. The accusation was so outrageous, so beyond the bounds of acceptable behavior, that I initially couldn't process it. Madison was not only attacking my mental capacity and my financial decisions, she was now questioning whether I had murdered her own father. Ashley, are you certain about this? This isn't just gossip or misunderstanding? I heard her say it myself, at a party last weekend. She was drunk and angry, talking about how she was going to prove that something wasn't right about her father's death. She said the timing of everything was too convenient, that healthy men don't just drop dead of heart attacks. The irony was staggering. Richard had died of a massive heart attack while working in his garden, something that happened to thousands of men his age every year. He'd had a family history of heart disease and had been warned by his doctor to reduce his stress levels and get more exercise. His death, while sudden, was not medically suspicious in any way. But Madison was apparently so desperate to explain away her reduced inheritance that she was willing to accuse me of murder. The woman who had once called me an embarrassment was now suggesting that I was a killer. I thanked Ashley for the warning and asked her to let me know if Madison continued making these accusations. After Ashley left, I called Margaret to discuss the potential legal implications of Madison's latest claims. If she's accusing you of murder, even informally, that could constitute defamation, Margaret explained. But more importantly, if she actually requests an investigation into Richard's death, it could create problems for you, even if the accusations are baseless. Margaret recommended that I document everything Ashley had told me and gather evidence of Madison's financial desperation that might explain her motivation for making false accusations. She also suggested that I consider filing a restraining order if Madison's behavior escalated further. The thought of having to legally protect myself from my own daughter was heartbreaking, but it was also clarifying. Madison had moved beyond simple greed and manipulation into genuinely dangerous territory. If she was willing to accuse me of murder to regain access to her inheritance, there was no limit to what she might do. A week later, I received a call from Detective Sarah Martinez with the County Sheriff's Department. Someone had contacted them with concerns about Richard's death, suggesting that the circumstances warranted investigation. The detective was professional but thorough, asking detailed questions about Richard's health, our relationship, and the timeline of events around his death. Mrs. Sterling, I want to be clear that this is just a routine follow-up based on information we received, Detective Martinez explained. But we do need to ask some questions to close out the inquiry properly. I answered every question honestly and provided documentation of Richard's medical history, including records from his cardiologist confirming his heart condition. The detective seemed satisfied with my responses, but the investigation was still deeply humiliating. Can you tell me who made the initial complaint? I asked when the formal questioning was complete. I can't share specific details, but I can tell you that the person who contacted us was concerned about the timing of your husband's death relative to some financial changes in your family. They felt the circumstances were suspicious enough to warrant review. The euphemistic language couldn't hide the reality. Madison had formally accused me of murdering Richard. My own daughter had asked the police to investigate me for killing the man we both loved. The investigation was closed within 2 weeks after the medical examiner reviewed Richard's autopsy results and found no evidence of foul play. Detective Martinez called to inform me that the case was being closed and that no further action would be taken. Mrs. Sterling, I want you to know that we found absolutely no evidence to support the concerns that were raised, the detective said. Your husband's death was clearly from natural causes, and there was nothing suspicious about the circumstances. I thanked her for her thoroughness and professionalism, but the damage had been done. Even though I'd been completely exonerated, the fact that I'd been investigated for Richard's murder was now part of the public record. If Madison chose to publicize that investigation, she could cause significant damage to my reputation regardless of the outcome. Margaret advised me to take legal action against Madison for filing a false police report, but I was emotionally exhausted by the constant conflict. I wanted to focus on rebuilding my life rather than continuing to fight with my daughter, even though she clearly had no intention of ending her attacks on me. 6 months after the investigation into Richard's death was closed, I made a decision that surprised even me. I decided to sell the family estate in Marin County and move to a smaller property in Sonoma County, about an hour north of San Francisco. The house held too many painful memories now, not just of Richard's death but of Madison's betrayal and the legal battles that had followed. The new property was a charming Victorian house on 5 acres of rolling hills, with views of vineyards and mountains. It was large enough for entertaining but small enough that I could manage it myself with minimal help. Most importantly, it felt like a fresh start. A place where I could build new memories without being constantly reminded of old hurts. The move also served a practical purpose. It would be much harder for Madison to show up unexpectedly or to monitor my activities from a distance. I was tired of feeling like I needed to guard against surprise visits or unwanted surveillance. As I packed up the Marin County house, I found myself sorting through 40 years of family memories. Photo albums full of Madison's childhood, birthday parties and family vacations, school plays and graduation ceremonies. The little girl in those pictures bore no resemblance to the woman who had accused me of murdering her father, and I grieved for both of them. Among Richard's papers, I found a letter he'd written to Madison on her 16th birthday but apparently never given her. In it, he'd expressed his hopes for her future and his confidence in her ability to make a positive difference in the world. He'd also included some gentle advice about the responsibilities that came with privilege and the importance of treating others with kindness and respect. Real strength isn't about having power over others, Richard had written in his careful handwriting. It's about using whatever advantages you have to lift up the people around you. Money and social position are tools, not trophies. They're only valuable if they're used to create something meaningful. I considered sending the letter to Madison, thinking it might help her understand what she'd lost when she chose greed over family relationships. But then I realized that she probably wouldn't see it as her father's wisdom. She'd likely interpret it as another attempt by me to manipulate her emotions. Instead, I placed the letter in my jewelry box, along with other precious mementos of my life with Richard. Someday, if Madison ever genuinely sought reconciliation and showed real evidence of changed character, I might share her father's words with her. But that day seemed very far away. The move to Sonoma County marked the beginning of a new chapter in my life. I joined a book club, started volunteering at a local animal shelter, and began taking art classes at the community college. For the first time since Richard's death, I was building a life based on my own interests and values, rather than reacting to Madison's latest crisis or manipulation. I also started dating again, something I'd never thought I'd be ready for. Through friends, I met Jonathan Wells, a retired professor of literature, whose wife had passed away 3 years earlier. Jonathan was kind, intelligent, and completely uninterested in my financial status. Our relationship developed slowly, built on shared interests and genuine compatibility, rather than convenience or loneliness. Madison would probably have hated Jonathan, not because of anything he'd done, but because his presence in my life represented my movement away from the past we'd shared. She'd always been possessive of my attention, and would likely see any romantic relationship as a betrayal of Richard's memory. But Richard had explicitly told me, during his final illness, that he wanted me to find happiness again after he was gone. Don't turn into one of those widows who treats their husband's death like the end of their own story, he'd said during one of our last serious conversations. You have too much life left to live to spend it all in mourning. A year after moving to Sonoma County, I received a wedding invitation that surprised me. David, Madison's former fiancé, was marrying a woman named Catherine, a teacher he'd met through mutual friends. The invitation was addressed only to me, with a handwritten note from David explaining that he hoped I could attend despite the awkward circumstances. I decided to go to the wedding, partly because I genuinely liked David and wanted to celebrate his happiness, but also because I was curious about whether Madison would be there. David had been part of our family's social circle before his relationship with Madison, and it was possible that she'd been invited as well. The wedding was held at a beautiful winery in Napa Valley, with a small ceremony followed by an elegant reception. David looked genuinely happy, and his bride Catherine seemed lovely, warm, and down to earth, in a way that made me understand why David had been attracted to her after his relationship with Madison ended. Madison was not among the guests, and I found myself both relieved and slightly disappointed. Part of me had hoped that seeing her in a neutral setting might provide an opportunity for some kind of reconciliation, even if it was just a polite conversation that acknowledged our shared history. During the reception, I had a chance to speak with David privately. He thanked me for coming and asked how I was adjusting to life in Sonoma County. When I mentioned that I was enjoying the peace and quiet, he gave me a knowing look. "I hope Madison hasn't been causing you any more trouble," he said quietly. "I heard about the legal issues after we broke up. I'm sorry you had to go through that." "Thank you for testifying truthfully during the trial," I replied. "I know it wasn't easy for you." David was quiet for a moment, looking out at the vineyard that stretched beyond the reception venue. I really loved her, you know. I thought we were building something real together. Finding out that she'd been lying to me about something so fundamental it changed everything. Not just about our relationship, but about who I thought she was as a person. I understand that feeling, I said softly. Sometimes the people we love disappoint us in ways we never thought possible. Do you think she'll ever change? David asked. Do you think she'll ever realize what she's lost by treating people the way she has? It was a question I'd asked myself countless times over the past few years. Did Madison have the capacity for genuine self-reflection and growth, or was she fundamentally incapable of seeing beyond her own immediate wants and needs? I hope so, I answered honestly, but change has to come from within. It can't be forced by external consequences, no matter how severe they are. After the wedding, I drove back to Sonoma County feeling oddly peaceful. Seeing David happy with someone who clearly loved him for who he was rather than what he could provide had reminded me that it was possible to build healthy, honest relationships, even after experiencing betrayal and disappointment. 2 years after moving to Sonoma County, I received an unexpected phone call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, I heard a voice I hadn't heard in over a year. Madison's voice, but different somehow. Smaller, less confident, with an edge of desperation I'd never heard before. "Mother, it's me," she said without preamble. "I know you probably don't want to talk to me, but I need to see you. Please. It's important." My first instinct was to hang up immediately. Madison had exhausted my patience and goodwill with her lies, manipulations, and false accusations. I had no interest in being drawn back into her drama or providing her with another opportunity to hurt me, but something in her voice gave me pause. This didn't sound like the entitled, angry young woman who had sued me and accused me of murder. This sounded like someone who was genuinely struggling, possibly even desperate. "What do you want, Madison?" I asked carefully. "I need to tell you something. Something important. I can't do it over the phone." There was a long pause, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I think I'm in trouble, Mother." Real trouble. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet with Madison at a coffee shop in downtown Sonoma, a public place where I would feel safe and could leave easily if the conversation went badly. I spent the days leading up to our meeting, trying to prepare myself for whatever new manipulation or crisis Madison was planning to present. The woman who walked into the coffee shop 3 days later bore little resemblance to the polished, confident person who had humiliated me at her birthday party 3 years earlier. Madison looked thin and tired, her expensive clothes replaced by a simple sweater and jeans that had seen better days. Her hair, once professionally styled, was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore no makeup. But the most striking change was in her demeanor. Gone was the entitled arrogance that had characterized our previous interactions. This Madison looked uncertain, almost fragile, like someone who had been through an ordeal that had fundamentally changed her perspective on life. "Thank you for coming," she said as she sat down across from me, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup as if she needed its warmth. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," I replied honestly. "What did you want to tell me, Madison?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee, as if gathering courage for what she needed to say. When she finally looked up, her eyes were filled with tears. "I've been lying," she said simply, "about everything. For years. And now it's all falling apart, and I don't know what to do." I waited for her to continue, not trusting myself to respond, until I understood what she was really saying. "The birthday party," Madison continued, her voice shaking slightly. "The things I said to you, the way I treated you, it was all because I was scared. Scared that you'd find out what I'd been doing with my trust fund, scared that you'd discover how much debt I was in, scared that everyone would realize I was a fraud." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect what she was about to tell me. "I'd been stealing money from your accounts for over a year before Daddy died," Madison said, the words coming out in a rush as if she needed to get them out before she lost her nerve. "Small amounts at first, just enough to cover my credit card payments and keep up appearances. But then it got bigger, and I couldn't stop. The admission hit me like a physical blow. All the times Madison had claimed to be financially struggling, all her complaints about not being able to afford her lifestyle, she'd been stealing from me to fund her extravagance. "How much?" I asked quietly. "Almost $200,000, Madison whispered. "I thought I could pay it back before anyone noticed. I thought Daddy's inheritance would cover it and you'd never have to know." The scope of the theft was staggering, but what hurt more was the realization that Madison's cruelty toward me had been motivated by guilt and fear of discovery rather than genuine grievance. She'd humiliated me at her birthday party not because she thought I was embarrassing, but because she was terrified that I might start paying closer attention to the family finances. "The lawsuit," I said, the pieces finally falling into place. "You sued me because you needed access to the trust to cover up what you'd stolen." Madison nodded miserably. "I thought if I could prove you were incompetent, I could get control of the money and fix everything before you found out. I never meant for it to go as far as it did. I never meant to accuse you of the things I accused you of." "You accused me of murdering your father," I said, my voice harder than I'd intended. "You asked the police to investigate me for killing the man we both loved." Fresh tears spilled down Madison's cheeks. I know how terrible that was. I was desperate and scared, and I thought if I could just create enough confusion, enough doubt about everything that happened after Daddy died, maybe I could find a way out of the mess I'd created. We sat in silence for several minutes while I processed what Madison had told me. Part of me felt vindicated. All of my instincts about her behavior had been correct, but a larger part of me felt deeply sad for the frightened young woman sitting across from me, who had made such catastrophically bad decisions that she'd destroyed her relationship with her only remaining parent. "Why are you telling me this now?" I finally asked. Madison's laugh was bitter and self-deprecating. "Because I'm about to be arrested for embezzlement. Not just from you, from other people too. I got involved with some people who were running investment scams, thinking I could make enough money to pay you back. Instead, I just made everything worse." The final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Madison hadn't just been stealing from me. She'd been involved in criminal activity with other people. Her sudden appearance in my life wasn't motivated by guilt or a desire for reconciliation. It was motivated by the very practical need to confess before someone else exposed her crimes. "The FBI is investigating the investment scheme," Madison continued. "My former partners are trying to blame everything on me, saying I was the mastermind behind the whole operation. I have a lawyer, but he says the best thing I can do is cooperate fully and hope for leniency. And part of cooperating fully means confessing to stealing from me," I concluded. "Yes. I wanted you to hear it from me first, before it all becomes public. I know you have no reason to help me or forgive me, but I needed you to know that I understand how wrong I was. About everything." I studied Madison's face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculation, but all I saw was exhaustion and genuine remorse. This didn't appear to be another attempt to gain sympathy or extract something from me. It seemed like a genuine confession from someone who had finally run out of options and lies. "What do you want from me, Madison?" I asked gently. "Nothing," she said, and for the first time since she'd started talking, she met my eyes directly. "I don't deserve anything from you. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry. For all of it. For the things I said, for the way I treated you, for the lies I told about you. You were a good mother, and I was a terrible daughter, and I'm sorry." The apology was more than I'd ever expected to receive from Madison, but it also felt hollow somehow. Not because I didn't believe she meant it, but because it came so late, and after so much damage had been done. "I appreciate your apology," I said carefully. "But you need to understand that sorry doesn't undo the harm that was done. It doesn't give us back the relationship we lost, and it doesn't erase the pain you caused." "I know," Madison said quietly. "I know I can't fix this. I just wanted you to know the truth before everything comes out in court." I wanted you to know that none of it was your fault." We talked for another hour, with Madison providing more details about her criminal activities and the legal troubles she was facing. She was looking at significant prison time, and her lawyer had been honest about her prospects for avoiding conviction. As our conversation wound down, I found myself feeling something I hadn't expected. Pity for Madison. Not forgiveness, exactly, but a deep sadness for the choices she'd made and the life she'd destroyed through her own actions. "Is there anything I can do to help you?" I asked as we prepared to leave the coffee shop. "With your legal situation, I mean." Madison shook her head. "I don't think so. And even if there was, I wouldn't ask. I've taken enough from you." It was perhaps the first truly mature thing I'd heard Madison say in years. The acknowledgement that she had no right to ask for my help, even in her darkest hour, suggested that she had finally begun to understand the consequences of her actions. We parted ways in the parking lot with an awkward hug and a promise from Madison to keep me informed about her legal proceedings. As I drove home to my peaceful house in the hills, I reflected on how much had changed since that disastrous birthday party 3 years earlier. Madison had finally told me the truth about her behavior, but the truth was almost more painful than the lies had been. To know that her cruelty toward me had been motivated by guilt over stealing from me, that her accusations of mental incompetence and murder had been desperate attempts to cover up her own crimes, somehow made everything worse. At least when I'd thought she was simply entitled and selfish, I could imagine that she might someday outgrow those character flaws. But the Madison who had revealed herself in that coffee shop was someone who had made deliberate, calculated decisions to commit serious crimes over an extended period of time. That wasn't something that could be fixed with maturity or therapy. 6 months later, Madison was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for her role in the investment fraud scheme. She had pled guilty to multiple charges of wire fraud and money laundering in exchange for a reduced sentence, and had testified against her co-conspirators. The judge had been somewhat lenient because of her cooperation, but she would still serve at least 3 years before being eligible for parole. I attended Madison's sentencing hearing, not to support her but to understand the full scope of what she had done. Listening to the prosecutor detail her crimes was devastating. Madison had stolen money from dozens of people, mostly elderly investors who had trusted her with their retirement savings. The total amount of her theft was over $2 million. Far more than the $200,000 she had admitted to taking from me. During her statement to the court before sentencing, Madison again apologized for her actions and expressed remorse for the harm she had caused. But she also tried to explain her behavior by referencing her grief over her father's death and her struggles with maintaining her lifestyle after his passing. Even in the face of serious prison time, Madison was still trying to present herself as a victim of circumstances rather than taking full responsibility for her choices. Some things apparently never changed. After the sentencing, I spoke briefly with some of Madison's other victims, elderly people who had lost their life savings to her fraudulent investment scheme. Their stories were heartbreaking. People who had worked their entire lives to build modest nest eggs, only to have everything stolen by someone they had trusted. Meeting these people made me realize how lucky I was. Madison's theft from me had been significant, but it hadn't threatened my financial security or my ability to live comfortably. For many of her victims, the money she had stolen represented the difference between a secure retirement and poverty. I made a decision that day to establish a fund to help Madison's victims recover some of what they had lost. It wouldn't make up for everything she had taken from them, but it might provide some assistance to people who desperately needed it. In a strange way, it felt like the right way to honor Richard's memory, using our wealth to help people who had been harmed by our daughter's crimes. The Victim Assistance Fund became one of my most meaningful philanthropic projects. Working with elderly people who had been financially victimized gave me a sense of purpose and helped me feel like something positive had come from the terrible situation with Madison. 3 years into Madison's prison sentence, I received a letter from her. It was the first communication we'd had since her sentencing, and I debated whether to read it or simply throw it away. Finally, curiosity won out, and I opened the envelope. The letter was different from anything Madison had ever written to me before. There was no manipulation, no hidden agenda, no requests for money or assistance. Instead, it was a thoughtful reflection on her life choices and an acknowledgement of the pain she had caused not just to me, but to all of her victims. Madison wrote about her experience in prison, the therapy she was receiving, and her slowly growing understanding of how her behavior had affected other people. She mentioned the victim assistance fund I had established and expressed gratitude that I was trying to help people she had harmed. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," Madison wrote near the end of the letter, "and I'm not asking for it. I just wanted you to know that I think about you every day and that I'm truly sorry for the daughter I became. You deserved so much better than what I gave you." The letter moved me more than I had expected it to, not because it changed anything fundamental about our relationship, but because it suggested that Madison was finally engaging in genuine self-reflection, rather than simply looking for ways to manipulate her situation to her advantage. I decided to write back, not to offer forgiveness or reconciliation, but to acknowledge her letter and to let her know that I hoped she was finding some peace in prison. It felt like the right thing to do, the kind of grace that Richard would have encouraged me to show. The correspondence that developed between Madison and me over the following months was careful and limited, but it was also honest in a way our relationship had never been before. Madison wrote about her therapy sessions and her attempts to make amends to the people she had harmed. I wrote about my life in Sonoma County, my relationship with Jonathan, and my philanthropic work. We didn't discuss the past in detail, and we didn't make plans for the future. But the simple act of communicating without hostility or hidden motives felt like a small miracle after years of conflict and deception. Madison was scheduled for release after serving 3.5 years of her sentence, with the remainder to be served on supervised probation. As her release date approached, she wrote to ask if I would be willing to meet with her after she got out of prison. She wasn't asking to move back home or for financial support. She simply wanted the opportunity to apologize in person and to see if there was any possibility of rebuilding some kind of relationship. I agreed to the meeting, though I approached it with considerable caution. Prison could change people, but it could also simply teach them to be more sophisticated in their manipulations. I needed to see for myself whether Madison's apparent transformation was genuine or simply another performance designed to achieve a specific goal. The woman who met me at the same coffee shop where she had confessed her crimes 4 years earlier was barely recognizable as the entitled young woman who had humiliated me at her birthday party. Prison had aged Madison significantly, but it had also given her a gravity and seriousness that had been completely absent before her incarceration. She was thinner than she had been even at her lowest point before her arrest, and her hair had gone prematurely gray at the temples. But her eyes were clearer than I had seen them in years, free of the calculating look that had characterized her interactions with me for so long. "Thank you for coming," Madison said as we sat down, echoing her words from our previous meeting in this same place. "I know you didn't have to." "How are you adjusting to being out?" I asked, genuinely curious about her experience. "It's harder than I expected," Madison admitted. "Everything feels overwhelming after being in such a controlled environment for so long. And finding work with a felony conviction has been challenging." We talked for a while about practical matters, where Madison was living, what kind of employment she was seeking, how she was managing the conditions of her probation. She had been placed in a halfway house in Oakland and was working part-time at a nonprofit organization that helped formerly incarcerated women transition back into society. "I wanted to tell you in person how sorry I am," Madison said eventually, shifting the conversation to more difficult territory. "Not just for the money I stole, but for the way I treated you for years before that. Prison gave me a lot of time to think about the person I was and the things I did, and I'm ashamed of almost all of it." The apology felt more genuine than any she had offered before, perhaps because it came without any request for forgiveness or assistance. Madison seemed to understand that apologizing was something she needed to do for her own growth, not something that entitled her to absolution from me. "I've been working with a therapist to understand why I became the person I was," Madison continued. "She says I developed a sense of entitlement that made me believe I deserved things I hadn't earned and that other people existed primarily to serve my needs." It was an accurate assessment, and hearing Madison articulate it suggested that she had gained some genuine insight into her behavior. But insight was one thing, sustained behavioral change was another entirely. "What are your plans now?" I asked. "I want to find a way to make amends to the people I hurt," Madison said. I know I can never fully repay what I stole, but I want to try. I'm hoping to eventually work in victim services, helping people who have been financially exploited. It seems like the least I can do. The idea of Madison working with victims of financial crimes was both ironic and somehow appropriate. If she was genuinely committed to making amends, using her experience as a perpetrator to help other victims could be a meaningful way to do so. We talked for another hour, covering topics we had never been able to discuss honestly before. Madison asked about my life in Sonoma County, my relationship with Jonathan, and my philanthropic work. She seemed genuinely interested in my happiness and well-being, without any apparent ulterior motive. When we prepared to leave, Madison hesitated before speaking again. "I don't expect us to have a normal mother-daughter relationship," she said carefully. "I know I destroyed that possibility years ago. But I hope that someday we might be able to be friends, or at least people who can coexist peacefully." It was a reasonable request, free of the unrealistic expectations that had characterized Madison's previous attempts at reconciliation. She wasn't asking me to forget what had happened, or to immediately trust her again. She was simply hoping for the possibility of a civil relationship in the future. "I think that's a reasonable goal," I replied. "But it will take time, and it will depend on your actions, not just your words." Madison nodded, accepting the conditional nature of my response without argument. "I understand, and I want you to know that even if we never get to that point, I'm grateful that you were willing to meet with me today." Over the following months, Madison and I maintained sporadic contact. She would update me occasionally on her work and her progress in therapy, and I would share news about my life when it felt appropriate. The communication was careful and limited, but it was also free of the manipulation and hostility that had characterized our previous interactions. 6 months after Madison's release from prison, I received an invitation to a small ceremony at the nonprofit organization where she worked. Madison was receiving an award for her volunteer work with elderly victims of financial crimes, and she had asked if I would like to attend. I decided to go, partly out of curiosity about Madison's work, but also because I wanted to see how she interacted with other people in a professional setting. The ceremony was held in a modest community center in Oakland, with an audience of social workers, volunteers, and some of the people Madison had been helping. Watching Madison speak to the elderly victims of financial crimes was a revelation. She was patient, empathetic, and genuinely helpful in ways I had never seen her be with anyone before. When she accepted her award, she spoke briefly about her own experience as someone who had caused financial harm to others, and her commitment to using that experience to help victims recover and heal. "I can't undo the harm I caused," Madison said in her acceptance speech. "But I can try to prevent other people from experiencing the kind of financial exploitation that I perpetrated. Every person I'm able to help represents a small step toward making amends for my past actions." After the ceremony, I had a chance to speak with some of the people Madison had been working with. Their praise for her dedication and effectiveness was genuine and unqualified. Whatever transformation Madison had undergone appeared to be real and sustained, at least in her professional life. "She's been such a help to me," one elderly woman told me. "She understands what it's like to lose everything to someone you trusted, and she never makes me feel stupid for falling for their lies." The irony wasn't lost on me that Madison was now helping people recover from the exact type of crimes she had committed. But if she was genuinely committed to this work and was helping people heal from financial trauma, it seemed like a meaningful way for her to channel her experience into something positive. A year after Madison's release from prison, she asked if she could visit me in Sonoma County. She had completed her probation successfully and was now working full-time for the nonprofit organization. She wanted to see my new home and to thank me in person for the victim assistance fund I had established. I agreed to the visit, though I approached it with some trepidation. Having Madison in my home again would represent a significant step in whatever relationship we were rebuilding, and I wasn't sure I was ready for that level of intimacy. Madison arrived on a Saturday morning in early spring, driving a modest used car that was a far cry from the luxury vehicles she had favored before her incarceration. She seemed genuinely awed by the beauty of my property, commenting on the gardens and the views of the surrounding hills. "This is beautiful, Mother," she said as we sat on the back patio with coffee. "It feels so peaceful here." "It is," I agreed. "Moving here was one of the best decisions I made after your father died." We spent the morning walking around the property, with Madison asking questions about the gardens and my life in Sonoma County. She seemed genuinely interested in my activities and relationships, particularly my work with local charities and my relationship with Jonathan. "Are you happy?" Madison asked as we sat under the oak tree where I often read in the afternoons. The question surprised me with its directness and apparent sincerity. "Yes, I think I am," I replied after considering it. "It took a long time to get here, but I feel like I've built a life that honors both your father's memory and my own values." "I'm glad," Madison said simply. "You deserve to be happy." It was perhaps the most generous thing Madison had ever said to me, free of any resentment or self-pity about her own circumstances. The woman sitting beside me bore little resemblance to the person who had called me embarrassing at her birthday party, or who had accused me of murdering her father. During lunch, Madison brought up a topic I had been wondering if she would address. "I've been thinking about Dad a lot lately," she said. "About the kind of person he was, and the values he tried to teach me. I wish I could tell him how sorry I am for becoming someone he would have been ashamed of." "Your father loved you unconditionally," I said gently. "Even when he was disappointed in your choices, he never stopped loving you." "But he would have been so disappointed in what I became," Madison continued. "All the lying, the stealing, the way I treated you. He would have been heartbroken." It was true, and there was no point in pretending otherwise. Richard would have been devastated by Madison's criminal behavior and by the cruelty she had shown toward me. But he also would have believed in her capacity for redemption and growth. "Your father believed that people could change if they truly wanted to," I said. "He would have been proud of the work you're doing now and the effort you're making to help other people." Madison was quiet for a long time after that, and I could see her struggling with emotions she was still learning how to process. Prison and therapy had given her tools for self-reflection, but applying those tools to her grief and guilt about her father was clearly still difficult. The visit concluded with Madison asking if she could come back occasionally, perhaps for holidays or special occasions. She wasn't asking to move back into my life on a regular basis, but she was hoping for the possibility of maintaining some kind of ongoing relationship. "I'd like that," I said, and I was surprised to realize that I meant it. The woman who had visited me that day was someone I could imagine having a relationship with, even if it would never be the same as what we had lost. 2 years after Madison's release from prison, she called to tell me that she had been promoted to program director at the nonprofit organization where she worked. She was now overseeing services for dozens of elderly victims of financial crimes, and had been invited to speak at conferences about financial exploitation and recovery. "I wanted you to know because your Victim Assistance Fund has been such an important part of our work," Madison explained. "We've been able to help so many people because of the money you provided." The fund had indeed been successful, providing emergency assistance to elderly victims of financial crimes and helping them access legal and social services. Hearing that Madison was now involved in administering those services felt like a strange kind of closure. "I'm proud of the work you're doing," I told her, and I realized that I genuinely meant it. Whatever Madison had been in the past, she was now someone who was making a positive difference in other people's lives. "Thank you," Madison said quietly. "That means more to me than you know." A few months later, Madison called with news that surprised me. She had met someone, a man named Robert, who worked as a counselor for formerly incarcerated individuals. They had been dating for several months, and Madison wanted me to know about the relationship. "He knows everything about my past," Madison said. "I told him about the crimes I committed, about how I treated you, all of it. He says he loves me anyway, but that my past will always be part of who I am." It sounded like a healthy relationship, built on honesty rather than deception. The fact that Madison had been upfront about her criminal history suggested that she had learned something about the importance of truth in relationships. "I'd like you to meet him sometime," Madison continued, "if you're comfortable with that." I agreed to meet Robert, and a few weeks later, the three of us had dinner at a restaurant in San Francisco. Robert was a thoughtful, serious man who clearly cared deeply about Madison, but also had realistic expectations about the challenges they faced as a couple. Madison has told me a lot about her journey toward making amends, Robert said during dinner. I have a lot of respect for the work she's doing and the person she's become. It was clear that Robert saw Madison as she was now, rather than as who she had been before her incarceration. But he also understood that her past was relevant to their future together, and that rebuilding trust would be an ongoing process. 3 years after Madison's release from prison, she and Robert were married in a small ceremony at a park in Oakland. The guest list was limited to about 20 people, mostly colleagues from their work, and a few close friends Madison had made since her release. I attended the wedding, along with Jonathan, who had been a supportive presence throughout my complicated relationship with Madison. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt, with vows that acknowledged both the joy of their commitment and the challenges they would face as a couple. I promise to be honest with you always, Madison said during her vows, even when the truth is difficult or painful. I promise to continue working to become the person you deserve, and the person I want to be. It was a far cry from the elaborate celebration Madison had planned for her engagement to David years earlier. This wedding was about love and commitment, rather than social status and appearance, and it felt more genuine as a result. During the reception, Madison approached me with a small, wrapped package. "I wanted to give you this," she said, handing me the gift. "It's not much, but it's something I made for you." Inside the package was a small photo album filled with pictures from Madison's childhood and adolescence, images from the happier times in our relationship before everything went wrong. On the final page was a letter Madison had written, thanking me for not giving up on her entirely and for providing an example of how to rebuild a life after devastating loss. "I know I can never be the daughter you raised again," the letter concluded, "but I hope I can be someone you're not ashamed to know." Reading those words brought tears to my eyes, not because they erased the pain of the past, but because they represented genuine growth and self-awareness. Madison had finally learned to take responsibility for her actions while still allowing herself to hope for redemption. 4 years after Madison's release from prison, I received a call from her with unexpected news. She was pregnant, and she and Robert were thrilled about becoming parents. The pregnancy was unplanned but welcome, and Madison was both excited and terrified about the prospect of raising a child. "I keep thinking about what kind of mother I'll be," Madison confided during one of our phone conversations. "I'm afraid I'll pass on some of the worst parts of my personality to my child." "The fact that you're worried about that suggests you won't," I replied. "Good parents question themselves and work to do better. Bad parents assume they're automatically qualified for the job." Madison asked if I would be willing to be involved in her child's life as a grandmother. It was a request that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier, but the woman Madison had become was someone I could trust with a child's welfare. "I'd be honored to be a grandmother to your baby," I told her, and I meant it. Madison's daughter, Elena, was born on a bright morning in October, almost exactly 6 years after the birthday party that had destroyed our relationship. I was present for the birth, holding Madison's hand as she labored to bring new life into the world. The moment Elena was placed in Madison's arms, I saw something in my daughter's face that I hadn't seen since she was a child herself: pure, unconditional love. Madison looked at her daughter with wonder and tenderness, already protective of this tiny person who depended completely on her care. "She's beautiful?" Madison whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I can't believe she's really mine." Watching Madison with Elena over the following months was a revelation. She was patient, attentive, and completely devoted to her daughter's well-being. The selfishness and entitlement that had characterized her earlier life had been replaced by a genuine concern for someone else's needs. "I want to be the kind of mother you were to me," Madison told me one afternoon as we watched Elena sleep. "Patient, loving, always putting your child's needs first." It was a generous assessment of my parenting, perhaps more generous than I deserved. But it also suggested that Madison had finally gained perspective on our relationship and could separate my genuine love for her from the mistakes I had made along the way. Elena's birth marked the beginning of a new chapter in our family's story. Madison and I would never have the uncomplicated relationship we had enjoyed during her childhood, but we had built something different, a relationship based on honesty, mutual respect, and genuine affection. 5 years after Elena's birth, I was sitting in my garden in Sonoma County, watching my granddaughter chase butterflies among the flowers. Madison and Robert had brought Elena for her weekly visit, a tradition that had developed naturally as we all learned to navigate our new family dynamic. Elena was a bright, curious child who had inherited the best qualities from both her parents. She had Madison's intelligence and determination, but also Robert's thoughtfulness and empathy. Most importantly, she was being raised by parents who had learned from their own mistakes and were committed to doing better. "Grandma Victoria, look!" Elena called out, holding up a butterfly that had landed on her finger. "It's so pretty!" Watching Elena's delight in simple pleasures reminded me of Madison at that age, before entitlement and privilege had corrupted her natural joy and curiosity. It gave me hope that this next generation would be different, that the cycle of destructive behavior that had characterized our family could finally be broken. Madison approached where I was sitting, holding 2 cups of tea and wearing the contented expression of someone who had found peace with her life. "Thank you," she said as she sat down beside me. "For what?" "For not giving up on me completely, for leaving the door open for redemiliation even when I didn't deserve it, for being the kind of grandmother to Elena that I wish I had been the kind of daughter to you." We sat together in comfortable silence, watching Elena explore the garden and listening to her delighted laughter. The woman beside me was not the same person who had humiliated me at her birthday party 9 years earlier, just as I was not the same person who had been devastated by that humiliation. We had both learned that love sometimes required difficult choices, that enabling bad behavior was not the same as showing compassion, and that redemption was possible even after the most serious betrayals. Most importantly, we had learned that family relationships could be rebuilt on new foundations, even after the original structure had been completely destroyed. The inheritance that Madison had lost was measured in millions of dollars, but what we had both gained was far more valuable. We had learned to value honesty over appearance, character over wealth, and genuine connection over financial dependency. We had discovered that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to let them experience the consequences of their choices, even when those consequences are painful to watch. As the sun set over the Sonoma Hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment. The woman who had called me embarrassing at her birthday party had learned that true embarrassment came not from aging or wearing vintage dresses, but from treating other people with cruelty and disrespect. The inheritance she had left with was not money or property, but something far more valuable: self-awareness, genuine remorse, and the opportunity to become someone worthy of love and respect. It had taken years of consequences, including prison time and the loss of her original inheritance, but Madison had finally learned lessons that no amount of money could have taught her. Elena ran back to us, breathless with excitement about the creature she had discovered in the garden. Madison scooped her daughter up in her arms, spinning her around as Elena giggled with delight. In that moment, watching my daughter be the kind of mother I had always hoped she would become, I felt a deep sense of peace. The inheritance I had given Madison by reducing her financial legacy had turned out to be the greatest gift I could have offered her: the chance to discover who she really was when stripped of unearned privilege and forced to confront the consequences of her actions. It had been a painful gift for both of us, but it had ultimately led to genuine transformation and the possibility of authentic relationship. As we prepared to head inside for dinner, Elena took my hand in one of hers and Madison's hand in the other, linking the 3 generations together. We were not the same family we had been 9 years earlier, but we were something better: a family built on truth, forgiveness, and the hard-won wisdom that comes from surviving betrayal and learning to love again. The story that had begun with humiliation and ended with redemption reminded me that sometimes the most valuable inheritances are not the ones we receive, but the ones we choose to leave behind. Madison had inherited a different legacy than the one she had expected, but it was ultimately a far more meaningful one. She had learned that true wealth came not from what you could take from others, but from what you could give to them. And I had learned that love sometimes requires letting go, that parenting doesn't end when your children become adults, and that it's never too late to rebuild a relationship if both people are willing to do the difficult work of honest communication and genuine change. The butterflies continued to dance among the flowers as the evening light faded, and Elena continued to chase them with the boundless energy and optimism of childhood. In her laughter, I heard the echo of Madison at that age, but also the promise of something better. A child being raised by parents who had learned from their mistakes and were committed to breaking the cycle of destructive behavior that had nearly destroyed our family. The inheritance Madison had left with that night was far more valuable than money. She had left with the knowledge that actions have consequences, that love requires respect, and that redemption is possible even after the most serious betrayals. It was an inheritance that would serve her well for the rest of her life, and one that she could pass on to her own daughter. As we walked back to the house together, 3 generations linked by love and loss and the hard work of forgiveness, I realized that sometimes the best thing you can do for someone you love is to let them discover who they really are when everything else is stripped away. Madison had discovered that she was capable of genuine change, authentic love, and meaningful contribution to the world. It had taken 9 years, but she had finally inherited something far more valuable than money, the knowledge of who she could become when she chose to be her best self, rather than her worst. And that was an inheritance that no one could ever take away from her. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.